This video will describe the complete production of these Pysanky eggs, which I have entitled The Russian Stranglehold on Ukraine. This video is a little longer than my normal videos because I have included details on all the steps involved in the production of these Pysanky eggs. As a result, I have included this timetable for this video should you wish to advance to a particular section in this video. At the very end of this video are close-ups of each of the 5 Pysanky eggs produced in this video. This video describes the production of my version of a segmented wood Pysanky egg that symbolizes the struggles of the Ukrainian people in this conflict. I produced 5 separate and unique versions of this Pysanky egg, which I have entitled The Russian Stranglehold on Ukraine. I used 3 different woods for the production of these segmented Pysanky eggs. The white wood represents the Ukrainian people. The red heart wood represents the blood spilled on both sides of this conflict. And the black ebony wood used for the band around the center of the egg represents the Russian stranglehold on the Ukrainian people. The production of these Pysanky eggs was quite involved and took me about 6 weeks in total to make these 5 segmented Pysanky eggs. Most of the segmented discs were produced with 36 segments or wedges in each layer. I also added additional thin wood spacers of contrasting woods between each of the segments. As a result, many of the segmented disc rings encompass from 36 up to 144 wood pieces in each of the layers. However, the segmented rings for the top and bottom of the segmented disc only consisted of 18 segments per layer due to the difficulty of producing these top and bottom segmented disc layers with no spaces or gaps in the center of the segmented ring. For the first step in this project, I need some thin wood strips. I'll be slicing some maple and red heart woods into thin strips that are either 25 thousandths or 50 thousandths inch thick. I'll be using my automated Accu-Slice system to slice these long thin boards. But these boards can also be sliced using our standard Accu-Slice system, as has been demonstrated in previous videos. Here I'm slicing some red heart strips from a board that is 36 inches long, and I'm slicing strips that are 50 thousandths inch thick by 1.5 inches tall. These thin wood strips will later be inserted between the 36 segments or wedges for the segmented disc layer. I'll be using a single layer of these red heart or maple wood strips for inserting between the wedges or segments for some of the segmented discs. But for several of the segmented discs, I prefer to use some 3-layer strips between the segments. Therefore, I use my glue jig system setup to glue these multiple strips together. In this case, I'm using a maple strip glue between 2 red heart wood strips. Each of these wood strips is 25 thousandths of an inch thick, and I'm using epoxy glue for this project. After applying epoxy to all of the surfaces, the wood strips are inserted into my glue jig system and then clamps are applied to squeeze out the excess glue. The glue strips remain in the clamped system for at least 4 hours for the epoxy to set and harden. And I'm ready to cut my wedges to make my segmented disc. And the wood I'm using is a piece of maple. This maple is 1 3/4 inches wide by 1 inch thick. And it's about 30 inches long, so I should be able to get at least 3 segmented discs out of this. And the other thing, I make sure my board is perfectly parallel on all sides and then also perfectly square. So you don't want it rocking on here. If it rocks on here, you get inaccurate wedges, so it has to fit nice and snug against there. And I did use risers on my clamps here to raise it up because my board's a little bit thicker than normal. And the other thing I always do when I go from this front fence or from this back fence to the front fence is to sand this front edge. This front edge where the bandsaw blade goes through does get a little bit of a fuzzy, so I just lightly sand off that fuzzy. Going the opposite direction, you don't need to sand it, but going in this direction, I always sand that edge. And now I have my Accu-Stop set. It's not quite going to a perfect point. I want a little bit of a flat on this front edge, so it's about a 32nd of an inch flat edge on this front edge. So again, against the stop, against the fence, make sure it's tight against the fence and tight against the bottom plate, and then clamp it in place. And then just keep going back and forth one fence to the other to cut the segments. The Accu-Wedge system is set to 36 because I'll be cutting 36 wedges per segmented disc. A couple other comments on the Accu-Wedge system itself. I did attach these sacrificial fences, which I described in a previous video. These sacrificial fences are great because they get that edge of this fence right against the bandsaw blade, so you minimize any chance of vibration at the end. you do get smaller burrs on the wedges as you cut them off. The other thing, I am using my dual dust guard here, the secondary dust shield, and that does help keep these roller bearings clean. I've already cut over 100, probably about 150 wedges on the system, and the system still rides very smoothly. And I'm using a new ramp too, that works great for minimizing the gap. There's no gap at all between the bandsaw blade and the ramp and the table on the Accu-Wedge system. And so there's no chance of my small pieces with the small front edge getting trapped in that small gap between the table on the Accu-Wedge system and the ramp. So that's why it's nice having all these systems fit together nice and tight with a minimal gap between the ramp and the Accu-Wedge table. And I said this dual dust guard, it works wonders. In a previous video I cut well over 500 segmented disc and never had to clean the bearings once. Just kept everything out of there. Okay, I cut 30 wedges. Now I have to go sand off the burrs. Because there is a small burr. And you can see the small burr on the front edge here. And all the other pieces on the back edge. And also some fuzzies on the bottom edge where the bandsaw blade cut off. So those fuzzies need to be sanded off too. So that's the next step, sanding off the fuzzies and the burr. Now I'm ready to sand the burrs and fuzzies off these wedges. And I normally don't like to work on my table saw, but this is a nice smooth flat surface, and it's nice for making sure I get these nice and flat because I don't want to get these bowed or twisted at all. Get a nice even pressure on the segments, so I sand off smoothly on all sides, just getting rid of the burrs and the fuzzies. And I do wear gloves so I don't chew up my fingers. It doesn't take much of a sanding. Like there's a small burr on the back edge. So just enough to sand it off. Both sides real lightly. And then the fuzzies on the bottom. And I just do that back edge too, lightly. And the front edge. And go back over this one time. And now that's perfectly clean. There's no burrs or fuzzies on that at all now. It's clean on all edges. There's the bottom edge. There's the bottom edge, no fuzzies. And there's a burr removed from that edge. So just continue doing this for all the pieces. Now this one has a burr on the front edge. So sometimes a little more careful on this. I might drag it slowly with a really light pressure just so I don't chip out that front edge. But be a little more careful when you have a small lip on the front edge, you don't break it out. And here we're all cleaned up. There's no more burr on our front edge. And the fuzzies on the bottom edge are all gone. And just keep going with the rest of it. And here's my 36 segments all put together. Ready for glue up. But first of all, I need to put inserts between each of these segments. This insert will be a 3-layer segment of red heart and maple and red heart. And I'll put one of these between each of these 36 segments. I just spent the last week gluing up my 3-layer strips. These contain 2 outer layers of red heart and a center layer of maple. And I made 15 of these. And it took me a whole week to glue these up because the setup time for the epoxy is about 4 to 5 hours. So I was only able to glue up 3 of these today. But they're all done now and ready to slice in individual pieces to make inserts between each of these segments on my pieces. So these need to be cut on my modeling table saw. So let me take you over to the table saw now and we'll show you how we cut those. This is my modeling table saw, all set up to cut these slices. And I like using this system rather than a larger table saw because the curve of the blade is only about the 1/16 of an inch, so waste a lot less wood using this table saw. It's a finer blade and a thinner blade. So I have a stop here which adjusts the length of my pieces that I'll be cutting, and then this miter slot that keeps everything nice and square. So I'll be pushing against the stop and then running it through the blade. So the first thing is to cut off an end piece just to give you a nice square end, and then we'll start cutting the individual pieces. The next step is just to sand the fuzzies at the bottom where the blade cut through the pieces. So just round that off, clean it up on both edges. Like so there. Then insert these between each of the segments. And there's my final assembly. So let me finish setting up the rest of these. I have a total of 6 of these to do. Next I need to glue the 36 wedges and 3-layer spacers for the segmented disc for the main body of the Pysanky egg. I first of all printed out a center alignment jig using my 3D printer. The center pin on this jig is the exact diameter as the center hole of the fully assembled segmented disc. Using this jig will assure that the segmented disc and all the wedges and spacers will be aligned and the finished segmented disc will be perfectly round. Because there are 72 pieces that need to be glued for this segmented disc, I'm using epoxy glue. The epoxy glue is a setup time of about 30 minutes, which will give me ample time to apply glue to all the surfaces of the wedges and spacers. As I apply glue to the surfaces, I line them on the glue-up jig, taking care to make sure the black alignment marks on the wedges face up and alternate from inside to outside. This will assure that the finished segmented disc will not have any gaps between any of the segments. I use a series of rubber bands to round the segments to hold them in place. Force all the pieces towards the center pin of the glue-up jig and also force out any excess epoxy glue from the joints. I then double check all the joints of the wedges. The glued-up segmented disc is set aside to allow the epoxy to set for about half an hour. I then remove the glue-up jig from the center. It is important that this glue-up jig be removed as soon as possible, otherwise it may be difficult or near impossible to remove it later. The segmented disc is then allowed to dry for at least 4 hours to thoroughly dry the epoxy glue. Rubber clamping bands are then removed and the segmented disc is cleaned up using a wire wheel to remove the excess epoxy. The segmented disc is then further cleaned up on my disc sander to smooth out the top and bottom surfaces as well as round out the outside circular surface. In a likewise manner, I made a number of additional segmented disc ring design patterns. Some of these segmented discs were made using maple for the 36 segmented disc, and others were made using red heart wood for the segmented disc. For most of these segmented discs, I inserted the thin wood spacers of a contrasting wood, either maple or red heart, between each of the 36 wedges of the segmented disc. For the production of these segmented discs, I used the same procedures as described previously. I once again used the Accu-Slice system to slice the 36 wedges for each of the segmented disc layers. Then I sanded the segmented wedges and finally glued the segmented wedges and spacers together using epoxy glue as was described previously. My plan was to produce a wide range of segmented disc designs that I would be able to assemble into a number of different unique design patterns for the finished segmented eggs. This is an example of the production of one of the red heart segmented disc with maple wood spacers. Well, I have my segmented disc for the main body of this new egg with my maple and then my inserts in between the maple segments. And now I want to make my ring that's going to be in the center. It's going to go out a little bit further. So this segmented disc measures about just a little less than 3.5 inches in diameter. But I want my center ring to be a little bit larger, probably around 3 3/4 inches. So I have my spreadsheet I printed out. I printed this out from the Woodturner Pro software, and I created this spreadsheet where I can determine what OD of ring I want and then what size segmented disc I need. And so to get a segmented disc that's say 3 3/4 of an inch, my segment should be 0.33 inches wide. I've already cut a couple of segments on here to get it set up, and right now my segment, which is going to have an insert into it, this is the insert material I'm going to be using. It's a combination of maple and red heart, and I can't just use red heart because you won't be able to see it red heart with the dark black ebony wood. So the combination of the two pieces together, my segmented disc and my insert, is around 0.35 inches. But according to my chart, in order to get a disc that's say 3 7/8 inch diameter, it should be 0.34. And this right now is measuring 0.35. So if I turn my index wheel two notches, which would be a 1/10,000 of an inch, that would make it 0.34, which would give me a 3 7/8 inch diameter disc, which should be just about right. I've got plenty of thickness on my ebony board, so I have no problem getting smaller than that if I need smaller, but I think that's what I'll do. So I'll take my indexing wheel and I'll turn it inward 2 notches on this index wheel. So this is what's 1, that's 2. So let me move my piece over, and we'll cut this first segmented disc and see what it measures out at. And 3.4, which is exactly what I wanted, so those should be good. So I got 2 done, I need 34 more. And here's my finished assembled segmented disc with the ebony wood and the maple and red heart spacers. And it measures about 3 7/8, just a hair under 4 inches, which is exactly what I wanted. If I compare it to my other discs, it's about, a little bit bigger, about a 1/4 inch extension, just what I wanted. So this is all ready to glue up now, and we'll start assembling this segmented disc. These are all the segmented pieces for the eggs I'm working on, which I'll be getting to a little bit later. But I am working on these 2 pieces. If I want to put some of these pieces with the lines in it, and then put solid pieces top and bottom. So these are all set to go. I made my jig. These are my glue up jigs for these. And they're exactly the same size OD. Same thing here, same size OD. And I have plates on top, glue up plates. So the next thing is I got to glue these to a piece of MDF so I can cut them on the Accu-Slice system. So that's what the next step is, to glue these onto MDF. And I do want to put lines on here first. And the purpose of lines is if I were to get these and cut multiple pieces and then rotate them and stagger them, this disc or this segment here may be slightly different than this because of various things, both cutting irregularities and also glue up irregularities. So it's important when I put these back together that they line up. So that's why I put my lines on here. So now I'm ready to glue these up. I did take these, and when they were glued up, they look like this. All the epoxy on here. So I had to sand these down, sand the surfaces flush, sand the edges around them off, get rid of all the excess glue. And then when they're finished, they look like this, pretty much cleaned up. Not 100% cleaned up, but pretty close. So now I'm ready to glue these up, and I do use Type Bond 3 glue for this process. Okay, just let those dry for, actually I'll let them dry till tomorrow because it's later ready today. So I'll be cutting these on the Accu-Slice system tomorrow. But I'll be doing cutting off pieces, probably some pieces 50 thousandths, maybe some 100,000 inch thick. Shown here are some of the many segmented discs that I slice using the Accu-Slice system. Most of the segmented discs that I'm slicing have contrasting wood strips between the segments, but some of the segmented discs are solid, one color of wood, that I'll be using for spacers between the other segmented disc. The segmented discs that I just finished gluing up are all between 1 inch and 2 inches thick. After all of the segmented discs have been glued to the MDF boards as described previously, they are attached to the carriage on the Accu-Slice system. For most of these thin segmented discs, the Accu-Slice index system was set to slice discs that will be 100,000 inch thick. I'll be slicing these segmented discs using my Accu-Slice system. I could have sliced these segmented discs using my standard model AS266 Accu-Slice system, but for this project I elected to use my automated Accu-Slice system just because I have a lot of segmented discs to slice into thinner discs, and the automated system would just be faster. Here I'm slicing the maple segmented discs with the 3-layer spacers between the segments. These will be used for the main body for the Pysanky eggs. Later, these segmented discs will be aligned and re-glued back together and arranged to a variety of designs and patterns for the finished segmented Pysanky eggs. So I have my next egg all designed, all the components assembled. So now I have to glue everything up because nothing's been glued up here at all. So all these pieces need to be glued up, of course alternating the segments. And so I'll be gluing these up in sections, like that'll probably be one section. That'll be a section there. There and there. So let me start with this center section. And I have my alignment marks and I'll be alternating these segments. So these will be alternating these to a pattern which will look something like that. So I have my jig all set up here, so let me start gluing it up. I designed the plastic jigs for gluing up the segments using the Fusion 360 software to design the jig, and then using my Bamboo 3D printer to print out the jig using PLA plastic. The design and production of these glue-up jigs were described in a previous YouTube video. The jig was designed to allow the segmented discs both to align on the interior holes of the segmented disc as well as the outside circumference of the segmented disc. This provides for the optimum alignment of the segmented disc. I'm using Titebond glue for the gluing up of the segmented disc. I prefer to use Titebond glue due to its fast setup time. The Titebond glue is coated on both sides of the segmented disc, and then the segmented discs are placed into the glue-up jig. The segmented discs are sequentially added to the glue-up jig, and each disc is rotated by 1/2 of a segment to obtain the required pattern. When the gluing and alignment is complete, the assembly is clamped using some hand clamps to squeeze out the excess glue. The alignment of each segmented disc is rechecked, and if necessary, the clamps are removed and the discs are realigned. The glued up discs are then allowed to set and dry for at least 30 minutes before proceeding to the next step. Next, I'll be gluing up the maple segmented disc rings for the main body of the Pysanky eggs. Each of these assemblies consists of 10 segmented rings. Since the Titebond glue sets up fairly quickly, I'll be gluing up these segmented discs in sets of 5 segmented discs at a time. I've used the same procedures as described previously, applying the Titebond glue to all surfaces, aligning each segmented disc as it added to the assembly, and when complete, clamping the segmented disc to squeeze out the excess glue. I am paying particular attention to the alignment of each of the segmented discs, and if necessary, realigning the disc during the glue up and clamping steps. These segmented discs are then allowed to set and dry for at least 30 minutes before proceeding. After the glued segmented disc assembly has dried, the clamps are removed and the remaining segmented discs are added to the assembly using these same procedures. Here I'm using a rag to remove the excess glue that was squeezed out of the glued up segmented disc assembly. This just makes cleanup later much easier. The second set of segmented discs for the main body of the Pysanky egg are then glued up using these same procedures. Here's a close-up of the complete set of segmented discs for the main body of the Pysanky eggs. Finally, the top and bottom segmented disc assemblies for this Pysanky egg are glued up. These assemblies consist of a variety of segmented disc design patterns. Since each of these segmented discs vary in diameter, I could not use the standard glue-up jig. I just needed to align and clamp each of these segmented discs by hand. Since there are fewer segmented disc layers in these assemblies, aligning and gluing up of these assemblies is possible. However, it did require several realigning of the segmented disc during the gluing and clamping process. Okay, I'm ready to glue these three components of this project together. Here's two top pieces and then the center piece. And I do want to be very careful to get these perfectly aligned, get the segments perfectly aligned. So to do that, I had to make a couple jigs. Because the IDs on these are different as well as the ODs, I made this jig, which it's a two-step jig. It has two steps on it. And this bottom step is for the bottom disc, and the smaller diameters for the larger disc. So I can glue these up, and I get these aligned, and they're not going to slip and slide all over the place as I'm gluing them, so they'll stay kind of put. And I can line up my segments just like I want them. So I want to get these aligned really just like that. And so I can use this jig to get them aligned. And then when I glue the second section, of course, I can't use this piece. So I made another piece, which is just a straight piece, which goes through both segments. And then I can glue that off. But of course I can't do it this because this moves. So that's the plan now, is to use these jigs to glue everything together. So the first thing I'll do is glue this first piece together. And I'll use this to align it and then glue it together. And then I can align my segments and then use some clamps to clamp everything together. And of course, double check my alignment. Clear off some of this excess glue. I can show you how those segments align. So they're alternating segments on the bottom, the very bottom down there. So I'll let that dry for at least an hour, and then I'll glue on the second piece. A small plastic hammer was required to knock the plastic alignment tube free from the glued disc assembly. It is important not to leave these plastic alignment jigs inside the assembly too long, or they may be too difficult to remove. Next, I use the straight alignment tube to align and glue the second disc assembly to the main disc assembly body. I double check the alignment of this added disc assembly to make sure that it matches up with the opposite disc assembly on the other side of this total disc assembly. Once again, the added assembly is clamped together and the excess glue at the joint is removed. And here is a final three-component disc assembly for this project. All that is left to do is to add the top and bottom segmented disc assemblies to this Pysanky egg blank. These are the 5 design segmented plans I've produced for this video. Each one slightly different than the other, different in size, different in patterns. No two are exactly the same. And now they're ready for the final glue up. So each of these consists of actually 3 segmented components. And I do the final glue up on the lathe because I want to make sure that these are perfectly centered on the lathe when they're turned. So in order to get them perfectly centered, it's easiest to glue them up right on the lathe. So I'll show that in a minute how I actually glue those up. I have 2 here that are done already. These are all glued up. They're attached to the face plates and they're all ready for the final turning on the lathe. And these 3 have to be glued up yet. They're not quite done yet. But again, I use the typical ratio patterns. I measured my diameter of my piece, and my length is 1.4 times the diameter. So that's the pattern I use to design these. So it gives me a nice proportion for the finished egg. So these are the 5 final segmented disc patterns that I'll be using for this project. This is my 3 components to be glued together. Let me just put these up here first. So the first thing is to put my faceplate on the lathe. I am using my custom faceplates. They were printed on my 3D printer with a wood plate attached. And I'll be gluing this piece on here like this. I'm using the rotating tailstock with a vise attached to the tailstock in order to align this segmented disc assembly. Using the rotating tailstock unit assures that all of the segmented disc will be perfectly aligned to the headstock, and it will turn with perfectly center-aligned segmented disc. This is then allowed to dry for at least 30 minutes before adding the next layers of segmented disc. After the glue is dried, the tailstock vise on the rotating tailstock is released. The three-component disc assembly that was glued together previously is then attached to the vise on the rotating tailstock. This assembly is then glued to the previously glued segmented disc on the headstock. I did pay particular attention to make sure that I staggered the two joints between these two components. And once again, this assembly is allowed to dry for at least 30 minutes before proceeding to the next step. The Pysanky egg top disc assembly was then glued into this disc assembly using these same procedures. After completion, this total Pysanky egg assembly is then allowed to dry for at least 4 hours before it will be turned on a lathe. I then used these same procedures that I just described to glue up the other Pysanky segmented egg blanks that were developed for this video. After the assembly is dried for about 30 minutes, it was removed from the lathe. And here is the final segmented disc assembly blank for the Pysanky egg that is now ready for turning, but I'll still let it dry for at least 4 hours before I will turn it on the lathe. After attaching the assembly on a lathe, a rotating adapter was attached to the lathe tailstock and then advanced until it centers on the Pysanky egg blank. This just gives the egg blank some additional rigidity during the turning process. Most of the turning is done with a carbide round tip tool. I first of all rounded off the edges of the protruding ebony center feature ring. Then I proceeded to shape the top of the egg. I did not use any template or pattern for the shaping of the top of the egg. I just shaped it by eye. But the curvature of the top and bottom halves of the egg are slightly different, with the top half being slightly more tapered and pointed, and the bottom half which will have a flatter bottom. At one point I switched to a square tip carbide tool, just so it gives me a smoother, rounder surface on the top of the egg. I then switched to a pointed in carbide tool in order to shape the top of the egg closer to the rotating tailstock adapter. I do not want to remove the rotating tailstock at this time because I first want to do the majority of the turning on the base half of the egg while I still have the additional support provided by this rotating tailstock adapter. I'm using a pointed in carbide tool to shape the bottom of the egg, to remove most but not all of the material from the base of the egg. I will later finish the bottom of the egg when I attach the top of the egg into a vacuum chuck on a lathe. At this point I can now remove the rotating tailstock adapter from the top of the egg and then use a rounded tip carbide tool to finish turning the top of the egg. I then sand the top half of the egg, starting with 220 grit sandpaper and progressively finishing with 320 and then 400 grit sandpaper. A final sanding is done with a steel wool pad. The faceplate is then removed from the headstock on the lathe and then attached to the rotating tailstock adapter on the lathe tailstock. We've had numerous requests for this 1 1/4 inch by 8 TBI rotating tailstock adapter for the lathe, so we have recently machined and added this item to our website. Next, one of my 3D printed vacuum chucks was attached to the headstock on the lathe. These 3D printed vacuum chucks were described in one of our other recent YouTube videos. The tailstock is then advanced and the top of the egg is inserted into the vacuum chuck. The vacuum is then turned on to hold the top of the egg in place. Using this method of attaching the egg to the vacuum chuck while it is still attached to the faceplate on the tailstock will ensure that the egg will be perfectly aligned on the lathe during the final turning of the egg base. I'm using both a pointed in carbide tool and a parting tool to finish the bottom of the egg and to part it off from the faceplate. After the faceplate has been removed, the bottom of the egg is finished. I'm using a rounded tip carbide tool to finish the shaping of the contour of the bottom of the egg. However, I'm using much finer cuts with this tool, since the vacuum chuck does not hold the egg as nearly firmly as it was held by the faceplate. The bottom of the egg is once again sanded using 220, then 320, and finally 400 grit sandpapers. A final sanding is done with steel wool. The vacuum is turned off, and after a few seconds, the finished Pysanky egg is released from the vacuum chuck. And here is the finished segmented Pysanky egg. I then proceeded to turn the remaining Pysanky eggs for this video using the same procedures just described. The segmented Pysanky eggs were then finished with bush oil. This concludes this video on production of my version of a segmented wood Pysanky egg that symbolize the struggles of the Ukrainian people in a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. I produced 5 separate and unique versions of this Pysanky egg, which I have entitled The Russian Stranglehold on Ukraine. Each of these Pysanky eggs is slightly different from one another. No two are exactly the same. I used 3 different woods for the production of these segmented wood Pysanky eggs. The white maple wood represents the Ukrainian people. The red heart wood represents the blood spilled on both sides of this conflict. The black ebony wood used for the band around the center of the egg represents the Russian stranglehold on the Ukrainian people. The following are close-ups of each of these Pysanky wood segmented eggs. Thank you for watching this video. If you have any questions or would like additional information on these segmented wood Pysanky eggs, please contact me via email or by phone. And thank you for watching.